Today on Trad Takes, I interview a special guest who is an engineer working on GPS. Join me as I learn about this vital system in today's world. Welcome to Trad Takes, hosted by the Traditionalists. I'm your host, Eric Kosovich, and this is episode 3 of Trad Takes. Thank you for joining me this week. If you like what you hear, please like and share, and even if you don't like it, do consider subscribing to the Traditionalists. Make sure to ring the bell so that you're notified when a new video is released. Today's episode is going to be a little different. I will spend the whole episode interviewing my guest on GPS and how it works. If you left a comment on the previous episode hoping that I would start today's by reading it and addressing it, fear not. I will make up for it in episode 4 by reading and addressing 2 comments, one from last episode and one from today's. So without further ado, on to the interview. My guest today is Steven. Steven is a senior systems integration and test engineer at one of the leading aerospace and defense companies. Thanks for joining me, Steven.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So to start the interview off here, I just want to get the 30,000 foot view of what your job is and what you do. And explain it to me like I'm a hobo, like I don't know what all these terms mean.
Okay, so I work for the ground system for GPS, and then just an overview of GPS. It's, the satellites in space that, just beam down their signal to Earth, and then, you can use whatever device like your phone or a receiver to calculate your position wherever you are on Earth. And then you can use that to get to wherever you need to go. And that's also a timing system. So for precise timing for cell phones and airplanes and ATM transactions and everything. And then so my job, go ahead.
GPS, let's just take a step back. GPS, this is what drives like Google Maps and programs like that, right?
Yeah, none of those would work without a satellite system. So GPS is the main one. There's also Galileo, which is the European Union's version, GLONASS, which is the Russian one, and then Beidou, which is the Chinese version.
Cool. And then before I interrupted, you were going to say what you deal with this, but when you say ground system, what does that mean?
Yeah, so the satellites are just up in space in their orbit already. They're pretty self-sufficient, but we need a ground system to be able to talk to them specifically. So we have the system based in Colorado, and then we have antennas in other locations near the equator that talk to them, so we're able to upload them and then move them when needed. So if they're drifting off course or they're going to hit into a object up in space, we need to be able to move them, or we need to be able to tell them, hey, one of these satellites for GPS is not working right, or we have a new one that we launched up there, and tell them that, hey, this one exists now, so they can all talk to each other. So we just kind of keep it going correctly. And we need to talk to each satellite every day in 24-hour period. It could go longer than that, but it would just become less accurate the longer you would go on.
So when you say you and when you say we, that's you and your team here in Colorado?
Yeah, that's correct.
And
And then,
you are you just one team, and are there other teams worldwide also working on this sustaining of GPS, or is that just your group? Are you the main ones doing that?
so for the ground system, we're the only one doing it right now. We are trying
Worldwide.
to, yes, for GPS. The other systems like Galileo and GLONASS for the Russians and Europeans, they have their own teams doing their own thing.
Cool. All right, so tell me exactly what you do. I mean, exactly to a high level, what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, on a day-to-day basis, it's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of writing documents and instruction manual type of things for the U.S. Space Force, who owns GPS, so that the operators there, who are enlisted and officer Space Force people, can run it. And so we make the software, and then what I do is I test the software and integrate it into the system. So the software engineers write stuff, the cyber team does things. There's a bunch of hardware,
What, yeah,
networking. There's a bunch of
what sort of software and things are we talking about here? Like updates to keep them maintained, or improvements, or
a little bit of both. So it's an old system. There's a competitor company making um, a replacement, but they're way behind schedule. So we are still active and we're still making incremental updates to it. So, modernized signals. Right now, there's the legacy and modernized. The ground system was not meant to handle the modernized system. So we had to completely rewrite the software and kind of tack that on to the old system to make it work with that. And then when the Space Force says, "Hey, we want this new capability," or "this is happening," or enough new satellites have been launched that the ground system now needs to be able to do something, we need to be able to write the software and integrate that in so that it works and uses it.
the old system that you mentioned, the one that you're currently kind of band-aiding to keep up to date with modern technology. How old is that? When was it implemented?
So in its current format, it was implemented in 2007. It was on a mainframe system before that, but then it
So
became a
almost 20 years old.
yeah. And then we have since, upgraded it quite a bit, even since I've been there. To now it's running on, Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Windows 10 and 11. But, it was running on old Solaris and Unix systems before that, and still is to a certain extent, but we've upgraded it quite a bit.
How much interfacing do you do with these satellites?
Me personally, not any. The
Your
the
team, I guess.
subcontractor, our team, we aren't legally allowed to touch the actual satellites with the communications network. The Space Force does that, but we can go onto the ops floor and help them out and tell them things. And we have our own simulators and test systems that are basically as good as real life, and then we use those all the time. So I can pretend basically and test out how it's going to actually work, and then in real life it will work almost exactly the same.
So you're working on a daily basis with the US Space Force.
Yeah, we don't talk to them
Who owned
every
the
day.
satellites and that type of thing prior to the Space Force existing? What was it, back in 2019, 2018, when it was created?
Yeah, when it was created in, it's been a DARPA project since the 60s, but the US Air Force has owned it officially since I think the 80s or 90s. Since the mid 90s is when it's been fully operational and civilians have been using it on regular basis.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah. Do you have more details or more information on what you and your team do on a daily basis, or have you kind of talked mostly about that? You're just maintaining the ground system and updating its software and making it as modern as possible with small updates.
Yeah, that's kind of the main part of it. It's just writing new software and then integrating everything and testing it, and a lot of cyber and security patches that we're always putting on. And then so we have to test the system to make sure that those didn't regress anything so that GPS still
Hmm.
works.
From a security perspective, do you deal a lot with protecting the ground system from foreign players?
Yeah, mostly on a cyber level, right? So it's not really a physical threat, because a physical threat would mean, the United States is under attack by a
Yeah,
foreign
Colorado
nation,
is pretty
basically.
central.
Yeah, and our ground systems too are on, Hawaii and Florida, and then other islands that are near the equator that are either American owned or British owned that we lease from them or are joint operated with them.
And there's
And then
not a large security concern physically for those ground systems.
Not at the moment. One could become a problem pretty quickly, based on geopolitical events. But the main issue is cyber attacks right now.
Hmm. What do you do in that realm to protect it?
Well, it's not connected to the internet, so that's a huge part of it. So it's on
So you
its
have it
own
isolated?
network. Yes. And then we have constant cyber patches, and we have our own designated cyber team, and they're constantly finding new ways to lock things down, which engineers is kind of annoying because every time they introduce a new thing, the safest system is not an
Hmm.
online system. So we have to kind of fight with them to make sure it still works while they're trying to shut as much down as possible.
Interesting. So there's a balance there. I'm sure the security people would just want layer upon layer upon layer and make it impossible to get in. But you guys need
Yeah.
the ability to get in there and change and work with things. So there's a balance there, it sounds like.
Yeah. And we've had issues where they've locked it down so hard in our test environment that we're like, we cannot use GPS. And they were adamant that these security um, things they were putting on were necessary. So we had to escalate it to at the time, Air Force and be, hey, do you want your system to work or do you want it to be secure? Because if you want it to be as secure as our cybersecurity team wants it to be, we'll just turn it off because it has the same use with their new patches on. So
Hmm. You mentioned something. This is probably just a small point, but I'm curious. You mentioned that most of the ground systems across the world are in places like Hawaii or southern Florida, near the equator. Why is that?
So the way GPS's orbit works, this is getting kind of deep into satellite
No, that's
stuff,
fine.
but
As long as you use terms that I can understand. Go as deep
so
as you want.
there are three main orbits above Earth. There's low Earth orbit, which are where probably 90 to 95% of satellites are. Those are ones you can physically see with your eyes if you're looking up in the sky. That's where Starlink are and all the internet satellites, and most of them are in there. And then GPS and all the other navigation satellites are in middle Earth orbit, which is much higher. I think it's around 12,000 miles above the Earth's surface. And then above that is geostationary or geo orbit, which is much higher, which is where like the weather satellites go. But GPS is at middle Earth orbit. And then the way their tracks go, if you look at a map on a two-dimensional plane, it kind of looks like they're doing a sine wave type of thing. And then if you look at a globe, a 3D version of it, it's six orbital planes all going around. And the majority of the time, you can see them better over the equator and then worse over the poles. So it's better to have the ground systems situated as close to the equator as possible.
Hmm. Why are the GPS satellites in the middle Earth orbit and not the low Earth or what did you say, the stationary,
Geostationary.
the geostationary?
So it's possible to mix it with the other ones. Low Earth orbit is way too hard to get full coverage. So you'd need to have,
Hmm.
just like Starlink, thousands of satellites to
And
basically get global
yeah,
coverage.
and so I'm trying to like picture this in my head. Is that because when you're at the low Earth, you're closer to the Earth, and so the satellites see less, the individual satellites see less,
Yeah,
and
that's kind of the gist of
the
it.
farther away they are from Earth, the greater their view.
Yep. So a geostationary satellite can see about a third of the Earth. And
Hmm.
then GPS satellites can see it's close to maybe a fifth of the Earth's surface at any given point.
Hmm.
And then low Earth orbit, sometimes they can barely see anything depending on how wide their thing is. So I don't remember why that decision was made to make them all middle Earth orbit. One of these systems for sure, the Chinese Beidou, they have, I believe, around 24 satellites in middle Earth orbit, and then one or two, possibly three or four in geostationary, which we have debated doing that, putting satellites in geostationary. But the problem right now is GPS can currently only support 32 satellites up at one time. And to
Hmm.
put one in geostationary would take one away from the moving one. which would
Hmm.
make the polar coverage worse.
So we have 32 GPS satellites currently in the middle Earth orbit.
Yeah, so it's a little bit more nuanced in that we can only have 31 active right now, just due to the way the system has been set up in the old days.
Hmm.
And then we have 31 active GPS satellites right now, and then we have, I think, around 4 or 5 spares as of right now. Those kind of fluctuate between having 0 and 10 roughly. It just depends on how long the old ones last when we launch a new one up.
And those spares are currently in orbit, or are they down on the ground waiting to be launched?
Those are in orbit. We have, I believe, 2 new satellites waiting to be launched, but we need to wait for the correct launch window, which I believe we have one scheduled for next year in 2025.
And then your department doesn't launch those, I assume. Who does that? Is that NASA, or do you contract it to SpaceX, or who does the actual launching of these satellites into that middle Earth orbit?
Yeah, so the actual launching is kind of a collaboration between the vehicle team. So, like GPS 3s are the current vehicles right now. They're built by the same company I work for, but they're a completely different group of people who take care of the vehicle side of it. And then they need to get it out to Cape Canaveral, Florida. And then the satellite that actually, or the rocket that launches it, is either through United Launch Alliance, which is a joint
Hmm.
company between 2 aerospace companies, or SpaceX. And I believe
Hmm.
the last 2 or 3 launches have been through SpaceX just because they're cheaper right now.
Cheaper and better at what they do. It's amazing how privatized uh, improves that.
Yeah.
Um, so, really serious question here. Do you name the satellites? Because if they're all in the middle Earth orbit, I would hope they have names like Gandalf or Aragorn or something like that.
So we, I guess, technically do name them, but no one else besides our internal team calls them that. And they're all very nerdy, named after navigators like Vespucci and Columbus. When that one apparently got some backlash from people who found out about that. And then now I think they're naming them after female scientists in the 1950s who helped with the initial calculations for the navigation system. But
Well, that's patronizing.
yeah, the normally they're just called, SV-71, or I think they have a United States Air Force 256 or 257. They have a bunch of different designations that people use, but
Hmm.
yeah, internally we don't actually really call them anything. We just usually call them by their launch designations. So currently, I think the latest satellite is SV-80. So there have been roughly 80 GPS vehicles launched up into space since the 70s.
Hmm. So everyone, basically, what I'm hearing is everyone takes themselves too seriously to hear Middle Earth orbital and think of Tolkien.
Yep.
Bummer.
I mean, we
Okay.
could do that internally, but I don't think it would gain any traction because a lot of people don't have a great sense of humor that we work with. So.
Well, that's annoying. So your team is the sole maintainer of these ground systems. What would happen if you all decided to retire at the same time, and or your division was shut down, or something drastic happened where you and your division was no longer taking care of the ground system? How long would GPS for the rest of us continue to work?
Yeah, so GPS is designed to work for 30 days without intervention. Every day we try to send uploads to every vehicle to keep it as accurate as possible. But if we didn't do that, it would be basically functional, at least to a certain degree, especially for civilians, for 30 days. Um, I think at this point, with how much we rely on GPS, things like self-driving cars would suffer within a few days, probably because of how accurate they need to be. If you
Hmm.
need to be accurate to within, inches or feet, it would get ugly pretty quickly, but it would be accurate to within, 15 yards or whatever for about 30 days. And then another 60 days, it would still be going on, but it would get worse and worse. And then after 60 days, it would be functionally unusable.
Hmm. So, from my perspective, our world is completely hooked on GPS. I don't think the average person could go without GPS for a couple of days, at least not a week, and not have their quality of life, I guess I could say, suffer. Um, is there concern at your level or even at higher levels in these corporations or the government, even, that the GPS system is fragile and are things being done to make it more robust and less, I don't know, a smaller chance of failure?
Yeah, and that's kind of what the main thing we're working on a daily basis is modernizing it and hardening it against things that could take it down. And then from the civilian point of view, it's nice that there are other systems, like especially the European Union's Galileo system, because that is about as good as GPS and it's open to all civilians as well. And then the Russian GLONASS is less dependable, both from an accuracy and what the Russian government could do. They could shut
Well,
that
that's
down at
not
any given
surprising.
point. Yeah, and the same with the Chinese one too. It's right now very accurate, but and open to civilians, but they could shut that down at any given point too. So there
So
are multiple options.
if America's GPS program went down, would Google Maps be able to go to the European Galileo system, or are they already on it? Or what would that look like?
Yeah, so it depends on your receiver. So a modern smartphone, right? If you had one in 2016, it might have only had GPS. My current phone, which was made in around 2022, has GPS, Galileo, and GLONASS capability. So as a civilian, you would still have the other ones as long as they were available. It's just
Gotcha.
having more of them is better. So
Well, and obviously that's a national security risk, right? If our system went down and now Europe basically can own us from a GPS perspective and make us do all kinds of things we don't want to allow us to continue using their system. I assume that's something that the US and the US government don't want.
oh yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of how Galileo started, is they saw at the time only the Americans and Russians had their systems, and they
Hmm.
were afraid that even the Americans who were their allies would shut it off for them at one point. So they developed their own, and then the Chinese obviously had the same concern. And for the Chinese, Russians, and Americans, we all our main purpose for these systems is a military guidance system.
Hmm.
Galileo was designed first as a civilian use, and the European Union could technically use it for military, but they don't have any better capability for their military, whereas GPS, GLONASS, and BETO all have military signals, which are more accurate and can do different things than their civilian signal.
Hmm. How did you get into this line of work? Without going into too much of your history, just, to the average listener who might be listening and saying, huh, I wish I could do something like this. What does it take to get to where you have gotten?
I mean, the first step would be to get a bachelor's degree in some form of engineering, like aerospace would probably be the most likely one, but also computer science, probably the next. We also have quite a few mechanical engineers and a couple of electrical engineers. We even also have a couple of people who got just a degree in math or in physics and who work with us. That's just to be the engineering side. You could also get a finance degree or business degree or something else and just work where we work, but not necessarily on the actual engineering
Sure,
side
sure. I
of
mean, I
things.
mean, work for the department, but not on the
Hmm.
engineering side.
Yep. And then
So,
so
is a degree? Why is a degree a requirement? Is that just like your hiring practices, or do you actually need those technical skills?
Yeah, it's mostly a hiring practice for our system
Hmm.
administrators who are also important, but not, I guess, technically engineers. We're hiring them now with either associate's degrees or not even associate's degrees. And then with the stipulation that they basically get paid a lot less until they get a 4-year degree, and then they'll
Hmm.
get bumped up to the same pay level. So I wouldn't say just, I mean, but I would say this for almost any job. You don't actually need the degree, but it is a requirement to have the degree, basically.
Hmm. Like a social construct sort of requirement.
Yeah, and just having a degree just shows that you can suffer through 4 years of abuse dealing with math
True. You know,
and
you
physics and
have that.
engineering.
Well, that you suffer through it, that you have the capability for it, and that you have the long term planning and commitment ability to dedicate 4 years of your life spending money, not making money, in order to
Yep.
play the long game.
Yeah.
So I guess I can see that, right?
Yep. And then so once you have that, right? And then I mean, for me it was kind of, luck to a certain extent. Um, my sister-in-law helped me get my first job right out of college because
Hmm.
she was an engineer. I worked not with GPS, but basically as a subcontractor to the company I now work for, working on a
Hmm.
weather satellite. And then once that contract ended, I applied to a bunch of different places. And then GPS saw that I had the satellite experience and then was like, hey, we could use you here. And then did the interview, did well in that. And then they offered me a job.
Cool. So obviously, you work primarily, I would say, in the private sector, although you do deal a lot with the U.S. Space Force, it sounds like. But you are closer to some of the top secret stuff too. So, without getting yourself or this channel in trouble, are there any interesting insights you can share about that top secret side of things, shall we say?
I
Like, do you
mean,
know that aliens exist, for example?
no, like all that, if there's other things to do, and the thing about anything secret or top secret or whatever is everything's kind of compartmentalized. So anything to do with GPS will be GPS specific. So, I won't know anything about any of the fighter jets or missile programs or anything
It's all
else, basically.
compartmentalized.
So I can only know about GPS specific stuff.
Cool. Anything else before we wrap up that you want to share that would be interesting for me or for any of our listeners?
Okay. So for GPS, I like working on it. Obviously, I've been here for almost a decade. Um, it's super important in everything in the world. I think right now we currently have about 4 billion active daily users. So it's almost half the
Wow.
planet's population at this point. And then it's used from everything, navigation and timing are the main um, purposes of GPS. So any ATM transaction you do, anything from the stock market, that's all timed using GPS signals. And
Hmm.
then anytime you use Google Maps, Apple Maps, any kind of navigation, it's using their own system, but it's using a GPS or one of the competitors' navigation satellites to find the route. And then modern farming, at least in the US and Europe and Australia and, modernized countries, they use GPS farming for at least commercially to plant rows and to harvest and everything to make the yields a lot higher. But yeah, GPS is pretty important and it's, used in everyday life for almost everything at this point. And I'm privileged to work on it and I enjoy it right now. So, and it needs to be done and someone's got to do it. So it's a good place to be.
Stephen, thank you for coming on my podcast. Appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a good one.
That sound means we're all out of time for today. If you enjoyed this interview and want me to do interviews like this with other people, please let me know in the comments below what topics or what individuals you would like to hear from. Please like, share, and subscribe to the Traditionalists and spread the word, whether for my show Trad Takes or for any of the other shows that are hosted by the Traditionalists. This is Eric signing off. God bless you all, and may God bless these United States of America.